just connecting.
Calm before the storm.
Christian, put your pants on real quick. You got time?
Hey, yeah, you get that treat in a minute.
Okay, I think we're live on that bombshell.
We're live. You didn't catch that bit, did you?
I have no idea.
Just don't stand up, Christian, please. Just don't stand up.
Okay, guys, yeah. We've got a few people logging on now. We're up to 11 viewers on one of our streams. So maybe we want to give it a couple of seconds just to let people get on, and then I'll introduce everybody and we can go ahead.
Beautiful.
Sounds like a plan to me.
Andrew, you've got some really, really nice mood lighting there.
Yeah.
It looks very sultry.
I don't know if Andrew meant for it, but I'm feeling
motion sensor outside. It will turn the light back on in a second.
Yeah, we've got 18 people on. We'll get started. Welcome everybody. As you're all aware, most of you will be sat at home with your tasting sets tonight. Absolutely delighted to be joined by, of course, my old friend and fellow BBS founder Andrew Watson, but also Christian, who's the Whistlepig brand ambassador for Axiom, and also Whistlepig's Master Blender, Peter Lynch. Thank you very much for joining us, guys. I guess is Christian or Peter want to start the night off?
I tell you what, I'll kick off very quickly right through the start of the video. First of all, thank you very much for having us and putting this together. It's absolutely awesome, awesome tasting to have on a Friday as well. You know, the magical day of rye, amazing. But I just want to start off the whole thing before we get into it with I've got a giveaway tonight. And this giveaway is centered around the best 5 of them, the best questions, but also the best tasting notes as well. So get creative with the tasting notes on this as well. And to show you what you're going to win as well, we've got, sorry, working from home. Whoa, that's close. We've got a beautiful lumberjack Whistlepig hat.
Ooh la la.
Which gets even cooler, certainly during this very kind of quarantine time. It has a secret stash of Whistlepig, which you'll be receiving as well, obviously. And not to mention some awesome little Boss Hog badges. Again, chuck in some awesome questions and awesome tasting notes, but that's enough for me. Gonna say hello to Pete.
How we doing, guys? Thanks so much for the intro, Christian. Thanks for being here tonight, guys. And a huge thank you, shout out to BBS, as always, for having me, for being part of the Whistlepig team, as we like to see it. These guys have been on the farm multiple times. They've been picking barrels for years. Great dudes. This is just something that, you know, in these strange times, this is what gets me out of bed, you know, these little, and full disclosure, I'm in Vermont. It's only about 3 o'clock for me. So, you know, happy hour's coming a little bit early. Can't be disappointed by that. Guys, just a little background on myself. My name is Pete Lynch. I'm the master blender for Whistlepig. As you can see, I'm very much dressed as a Vermonter. Christian wanted to do this tasting, and I was like, yeah, you know, it's hunting season. I'm going to be my tree stand. I figured it's the least I could do, though. So I got out of the tree stand. I didn't bother to change, you know. If you see just a floating head here, as Christian pointed out, then that's my bad. But it's very much on brand. This is kind of how we live up here. If you're not familiar, Whistlepig is located in the middle of nowhere in Vermont, in a small town called Shoreham, town of about 1,000 people. We were founded back in 2008, 2009 with just one mission in mind: bring the world the best rye whiskey possible. And that's really kind of meant something different over the years. I mean, if we look back even just 10 years ago, we didn't necessarily have a wealth of rye whiskey to taste, to drink as consumers, as industry professionals alike. Across the board, we were just kind of looking at these barely legal ryes. 51% rye in the mash bill, maybe not much more. Not terrible whiskeys, but one-sided, spicy and not much else. Well, in reality, rye can be so much more. It's just a matter of the fact that for the past 80 years, the world at large, and the US too, one of the major sort of rye drinking hubs of the world, hasn't really had access to this whiskey. If we bounce back real quick, pre-prohibition era in the US, rye was the spirit of choice. And that's for a variety of reasons. rye is inherently more flavor forward than most other base grains, corn in particular, which is going to be the base for bourbon. Rye has a much bolder, more present flavor profile that will stand up to longer aging. It doesn't lose that distillate vibrant character even after being in brand new charred American oak, which will typically overwhelm a whiskey within 4, 6, 8 years or so. Additionally, we're not necessarily seeing rye that's released at a high rye content. When Whistlepig 10 was first released, this was probably one of the only readily available 100% ryes with a decent age statement that you could find out there. And not just hitting those marks, but also actually giving you an experience that you want to revisit. I mean, early days, the Whistlepig team was not selling Whistlepig. The bartenders, the consumers, the people who enjoyed Whistlepig, who put that sip to lip and said, damn, that's something good. I want to have some more. And in fact, I'd like to try Gusto. It's bread and butter, and that's what's gotten us moving from day one. It's really that idea of what is rye whiskey? What can rye whiskey be? What does innovation for rye whiskey mean? We've seen that in everything from our 10-year-old, from our 12-year-old, from our Boss Hogs, which we'll talk about a little later. But we see it in a lot of ways that you maybe don't see out there in the world. I want to talk first a little bit about the 10-year, which again, got us off the ground, really sort of set the stage for what Whistlepig was gonna be. But for me, it's a little bit something extra because it goes a little bit deeper than that 10-year bottle you might see on the shelf. Our private barrel program at Whistlepig is really one of the things that we love to hang our high-vis camouflage or not hats on. That idea of, okay, we've taken these whiskeys that the world may not have been able to see. The 10-year-old, for instance, that whiskey was typically being used as a blending component in Canadian rye, Canadian blended ryes. We saved that whiskey, presented it to the consumer at 100 proof, at 100% rye. We decided, let's push that one step further. How can we increase that personalization? And so was born the 10-year private barrel program. Now, the 10-year itself is an age-stated whiskey. We know that 10 years old, it's going to have at the very least 10-year-old whiskey in there. However, that's a minimum entry-level requirement, and that goes across the industry. But specifically for Whistlepig, we don't necessarily just like to say, oh, it's 10, put it in 10-year-old. In fact, that's the opposite of what we like to do. My superiors don't love me too much because of my penchant for adding in significantly older whiskey to whiskeys that are stated at a much younger age. And there's a good reason for that. We're looking to hit that flavor profile time in, time out, again and again, no matter what. And that's going to mean something different, maybe not every single batch, but year in, year out. The simplest way to look at a blender, a whiskey company, if you will, that employs blending, which luckily for us is almost every whiskey company in the world. What we're doing is we're trying to give you a consistent product. Every barrel is going to mature in its own special, unique way, which is very significant to this tasting. We'll get into in just a second. But that's not necessarily the best thing if I'm trying to give you a product that's going to taste the same every single time. What that means is we have to look at each batch of whiskey. Maybe it was distilled on the same day, put in the same type of cooperage, aged in the same warehouse, and has therefore garnered a specific flavor profile. Maybe it's a bit spicier. That's one input to the 10-year or to the 15-year, to any of our whiskeys. Another input might be a sweeter batch, or a sweet and spicy batch, or more rounded, herbaceous with a nice finish. And it's taking all these different input whiskeys at different percentages and inputting them into a blend to produce the 10-year-old. And that might mean that we're dealing with 50% 10-year-old whiskey, 40% 16-year-old whiskey, 10% 17-year-old whiskey. It's going to vary batch to batch. But it's that idea of we have so much flavor to work with, so much vibrant variation in flavor. How do we produce one unified product? Now, the 10-year single barrel, private barrel program says that's all well and good, but let's spit that on its head. Let's turn that around. In fact, let's capitalize on these unique, special barrels. Those things that happen in the barrel via the aging process, different oak extracts interacting with different compounds from the actual spirit, going to create its own unique flavor profile. Instead of mitigating that by blending, let's capitalize on that. What we're doing at Whistlepig is we're constantly flagging barrels and or batches of barrels that have unique, significant, maybe outlier flavor profiles, but it's something special, something different, something that deserves to be consumed on its own rather than put into the regular 10-year. Not any knock against the regular 10-year, but it's that nature of how do we bring this whiskey to the consumer in its best possible format. And so was born the 10-year private barrel program. We're offering barrels that are minimum 10 years old, oftentimes well over, that are going to be coming from a variety of sources, typically from various Canadian distilleries that we source from. However, we source from quite a number of distilleries across the world as well. These whiskeys are going to be at cask strength as well. So we're going to see probably, honestly, minimum, I've seen some 95 proof 10-year, which sounds insane. We're looking at 100 proof product for the regular SKU. How do you get a 95 proof barrel proof product? Just the nature of aging. Oftentimes we'll lose quite a bit of proof depending on the environment that the barrel was resting in. However, we're looking at typically a range up to about 125 proof. There are some barrels oftentimes that are reaching proofs or ABVs well above that, but I don't necessarily want to give you jet fuel. Some people do enjoy that, but I tend to say that if the whiskey hurts you in any way, it's maybe not meant to be consumed that way. Maybe you want to add a drop of water in there. Maybe the blender should have decided to not bottle that as a single barrel project. One of the things that we love to do is bring our accounts into the fold as much as possible. What does a single barrel mean to you? Because a single barrel for the British Bourbon Society doesn't at all mean the same thing for a single barrel for Burns Steakhouse in Florida, for Gordon's Liquors in Massachusetts. Everybody's looking for something unique that's going to fit your flavor profile. And that's where we're starting here tonight, is with the British Bourbon Society 10-year barrel pick, Pit Q, fantastic whiskey right here. I want to talk about the 10-year private barrel program itself. What was that experience like for you guys on the British Bourbon Society end? Because it's not something that most people are privy to, but it's really super cool, super interesting. You get to see the Whistlepig farm. You get to actually thief from that barrel. I'd like to say we have one of the better barrel programs out there. And I like to put people like you on the spot in instances like this to answer potentially truthfully so I can see if I'm right or not. What was that experience like for you guys though, Andrew?
Yeah, it was all right.
Oh yeah, I guess, yeah, decent, you know. Yeah.
Listen, we've done it a number of different ways actually, barrel picks with Whistlepig, and through Axiom we've managed to pull samples into the UK from a number of barrels and host a tasting in a restaurant or a bar in the UK. Invite BBS members to all be part of that barrel pick, and then we choose which one we like the most, or which two we like the most in one case, and those were our two barrels. That was with nobody going to the farm at all. So that's one way we've done it. The other way, we've done an old world pick with Dave Pickerel, which was an incredible experience, where he said it was the most amount of samples he'd ever put together for an old world pick. So we're quite proud of that one. And
did he say that tongue in cheek, or did he say that in a nice way?
I said that in a nice way. Also, the last one I picked, so I went to the farm. I didn't pick a barrel, but what I did do was I was with Jamie from Pit Q, and that wasn't our barrel that was picked, because I was with him while he picked it. So I can attest to how good it was and is. And the last pick was recently, that hasn't yet been released, but that was a great experience. Essentially, the process is you get up, you have a fantastic breakfast at the farm. Which amazing.
I will oftentimes crash myself, you know.
Well, I'd crash it every day.
Chef Brooks' cooking is pretty damn good compared to my cooking.
And then you roll out of the door in the snow, down to the rick houses. The doors are wide open. It's pretty damn cold there, as you know.
Just a little bit.
And you're literally handed the whiskey thief. So and you're pulling from the barrels. It's an incredible experience, and it's just a sea of glasses, a sea of whiskey, and by the time you're done, you're done.
Oh yeah, you're done. I mean, one of the things I love, I hate that I love it, but I love it, is, you get groups who are coming in like you guys. You pick barrels, you know what you're doing, you know whiskey, you know cask strength whiskey. It's nothing new. Then you get groups coming in where it's a bit of a mix. It's people like you, and maybe it's people on the other end where their buddies along for the ride, no knock against them at all, but they don't necessarily know how to drink whiskey, let alone cask strength whiskey. And I'll look over sometimes doing an 8-barrel tasting, cask strength whiskey, 110 proof plus. We're on barrel number 5, and I look over and I see, 4 of those glasses are empty. And I see this guy with his 5th whiskey go, shoop, right down the hatch, the whole thing, 1 ounce. I'm like, it's 12 o'clock. Oh my God. It's one of those things where you get caught up in that experience, because it is pretty romantic, and especially coming to the farm, where I like to say I work on a farm. When I first started, you could come there and say, yes, this is definitely a farm. Now you'd come and say, this is a farm, but it looks pretty nice. There's a good reason for that. You know, we put paint jobs on stuff. I mean, you've been here for a couple of years, Andrew. You probably have seen things come up where we had our milling facility was just this kind of decrepit stainless steel shack, you know, some good alert to it, but it didn't have the dust suppression systems we want. It didn't look that sexy. You know, it's those little upgrades that we're making here to kind of enhance that farm experience. I'm upset that I wasn't there when you guys did your 10-year barrel pick on the farm, because one thing that I like to do, we were kind of mentioning this a little bit earlier, but I like to throw in whiskey that maybe doesn't taste that good. You know, you got 8 to 12 samples of cast strength whiskey, expect them all to be amazing. And sometimes I just throw it in there that is quite purposefully not even a 10-year single barrel. And it'd be with a group like you guys that I tend to enjoy, you know, your company. I know you guys could take a joke and just see the reaction, because I have had people definitely, you know, talking through their teeth a little bit, wanting to say something negative, but it's such a great experience. It's so interesting, romantic to be there, to be caught up in it, to be having whiskey. You know, you maybe don't think about drinking the 15-year every day, but when you're on the farm, I mean, that whole bottle's going down the hatch. You know, you better believe it. What do you think? This is going to be a bit of an aside question. Do you think you guys got a better barrel pick when you were on the farm or when you weren't on the farm? That bias removed or no?
It's a good question. It's a good question. I mean,
okay.
The barrel pick we did on the farm, they were older barrels. These were 15-year Canadian rye barrels, which is the oldest. You know, that's the oldest whiskey we would have bottled to date. So quite excited about that. What was interesting about my experience on the farm was that typically we tend to go for like higher proof. We're proof junkies. You know, this is a bourbon connoisseurs group.
Got
to be like the highest proof, or you know, I'm going to get shot down in flames. I did it all blind, completely blind. I did it with Josh actually, and it was tons of fun. But I made sure I didn't know what the proofs were, and the one I chose was the lowest proof.
There you go.
And when I realized what had happened, I was like, oh man, like I can't do this to the group. I tasted everything again and again, and Josh and I looked at each other as like, it's just better.
It's the one, you know, yeah.
Better, yeah.
So that's, and I mean, every barrel pick experience is going to be different, because you don't always have that one that just jumps out to you. Sometimes there's 3 that you're really kind of, you know, what is that really what made you pick this barrel itself? I mean, what about this specific barrel's flavor profile speaks to you, speaks to British Bourbon Society, and speaks to what your guys' idea of Whistlepig truly is? I mean, what made you at the end of the day say, this is BBS's 10-year barrel, boom, go?
For me, I can only speak from personal experience. I always tend to go for mouthfeel as like the number one, you know, driver. Is it oily? Does it coat the mouth? Is it kind of thick and viscous? You know, as much as possible, because I personally just think that is what makes a single barrel more special than the standard fare, if you know what I mean. It's, you know, it tastes non-chill filtered. It tastes, you know, you're almost licking that barrel with. It's
a presence in the palate, yeah.
Not watered down, yeah. That's what I go for first. Secondly, is it more unique? I always tend to have like the standard fare next to me as well, so I've got an outlier as to, you know, what you can pull off the shelves. And I always want to pick something that is completely different or as far removed from the standard as possible, because that is the beauty of a single barrel, in my opinion.
So could I jump in there? And so do you find that as like, or do you think that's a general consensus when doing like single barrel picks, that it's like either that real kind of rounded, beautiful, ticks all the boxes style rye whiskey single barrel pick, or do you think there's more of that appeal when it's that real touching the peak of the volatility, where it's a real kind of menthol bomb or something like a real butterscotch chalk ball or something of that nature? What do you think, kind of which route do you think it really goes down? Obviously, Pete's kind of touched on that with being out there. It's a very different experience versus that kind of consensus question.
That's a good question. And I think it may boil down to Alberta or Indiana, you know.
It could be. You never know, right? Exactly. And that's, I mean, that's one of the fun things though about the 10-year program is we do have a variety of actual sources of whiskey, where it might be ADL, it might be Indiana, could be another Canadian distillery that we can't disclose. And that gives you such a range of flavor profile that kind of satisfies that need. And that's what I love to hear is we're looking for a different barrel every time. We want to find those outliers that push the boundary. You know, here's what 10 is. Here's what you're looking for, something totally different that really kind of sets the stage there. And I'm definitely tasting this in this glass right here. Not a doubt there.
On that note, should we dive into the whiskey then?
Let's please. Yeah, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts again.
Beautiful.
As you may have noticed, I have not been a stranger to actually working on this whiskey for the past 15 minutes. So
I guess before we go into it, everybody that has received their pack had a tasting mat to download, which was a nice touch from Axiom. So I guess the first whiskey that we'd be trying is the Whistlepig PICU. Just to clarify the order, then it'd be the 18. Then it's the Spirit Mauve, and then it's the Samurai Scientist. Cool. Over to you. Sorry.
Beautiful.
So I'm just looking to see what flavor you guys are getting here. Again, I was asking what specifically drew to this whiskey, and you're talking about that mouthfeel component. That's such a huge part of whiskey. That's super important to me, and specifically in a cask strength whiskey where Boss Hog, for instance, one of the things that I'm looking for time in, time out for every Boss Hog is that mouthfeel component. It's got to have presence on the palate. If it doesn't, if it's thin, it's not even worth drinking oftentimes. I will say I did have one guy in Arizona who actually asked me why this whiskey was so thick, and he wished it was thinner, which was a first for me. But hey, to each his own. So yeah. I mean, to me, I get after 10 years minimum, a lot of barrel extracts, period. You know, it's not necessarily overwhelmed, but we're dealing with a rounded sort of, we're looking at the vanilla notes, sure. We're looking at some of the caramels, but you also get some of those more nuanced notes. The HMF, which is going to give us some of those toastier extracts, that toasted oak almost, which almost only comes out as the glass sits for me and oxidizes. The rye spice character too, very present. Hasn't quite gone away. It's not just a classic pepper spice, but I'm seeing some more of those baking spices as well. I mean, I'm typically looking for a whiskey, but I'm almost saying the 10-year private barrel program was made for people like BBS because we are looking for those outliers, those whiskeys that hit 10-year and then some, 10-year amped up to the next level. What about this whiskey, what specifically flavor-wise is amping this up to the next level for you? Or are you terribly regretting purchasing this barrel right now based on the look on your face?
I think it's bloody delicious.
I couldn't agree more.
100%. With this one, Pete, like I get a massive like menthol bomb. It's almost like that licorice Rizzler, you know, that licorice kind of cigarette paper, if you know what I mean. Like It's kind of got that menthol bomb. It's got that sweet edge to it as well, like licking the actual menthol gum, if you will. That's one thing that for me personally I love about rye, having that real big florality, that big mint bomb at the end. So for me, that leads always into the next sip, that kind of freshness, that brightness.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a hallmark of rye too, is that, let's say, herbaceous side, the herbal tones, which can come across in so many ways, but that mintier menthol, whether it's spearmint or just a sweeter mint, a winter mint, that it's a mouthfeel component at the end of the day. And it's a finish component too, where I take that sip, I swallow it down, I feel that almost refreshing minty aura coming back across. And menthol is a great way to describe it because that menthol for me is almost more of a descriptor for a mouthfeel component, again, rather than a specific flavor. I've had 10-year barrels that are spearmint for days. I've had 10-year barrels that are minty but couldn't be further away from spearmint. And that's something that I definitely look for quite a bit. Because rye, we love the spice, we love the baking spice, but we don't necessarily know to look for these mintier sides, these perhaps floral sides, but on the prettier side. I mean, I've had some ryes that are prettier than single malts, you know, my favorite single malts out there that are very delicate whiskeys, and it's not what you'd expect to find in a rye whiskey in any way, shape, or form. That's something I love quite a bit, and I think we see that menthol character, that minty, herbaceous side of rye in some of our other whiskeys. Farm Stock 2 is a great example. 18-year, you can absolutely get it. We'll get there, though, getting ahead of myself here a little bit, but yeah, that's one of the sides of rye that I mean, companies like Whistlepig, like Mastersons, across the US and the world have been able to show the consumer, hey, rye can be a little bit more, you know, rye can be a little bit more than just this spice forward profile and nothing else.
I just wondered if we want to hear. We've got some of our members who are on the live stream are commenting with some of the notes they're getting. I can read some of those out. So a few people saying cinnamon, a few people saying aniseed, spicy. Ed King saying a bit of mint and dill pickle. Sam Sussman, aniseed and Chinese 5 spice. Gary Tart,
oh nice.
Masby, he's getting. He says a lot of vanilla. Dan Beinborn says it's way more complex than a regular 10. For me, this reminds me of our very first pick that we did, our very first whistle pick that we did 3 years ago, maybe, was it now? It's got that kind of really complex rye underlying, you know, that you get from normally quite high aged rye, which I don't know, kind of like a sandalwood kind of vibe going on in the back. I think this is a really good pick, yeah.
It's really bright and vibrant on the nose as well. It doesn't smack you with alcohol, and it's almost kind of, yes, you get the floral notes, you get it's almost citrusy as well on the nose, and then you get that spice as well into the finishes. What's the proof of this, by the way?
So 59.7% ABV. Proof, you can do the conversion for that on proof.
That's going to be 118.4 for the less math inclined out there. This is my job. So whoever said a Chinese spice note, I love that Chinese spice note. You know, that's a great note there that I definitely get in a lot of our private barrels, in this one in particular.
Yeah. Yep. Some people, a couple more, and then we can.
Yeah, please.
Go. Ed King seems to be going with the. He's saying capers now. He was going with the dill pickle before. And then some people are saying the kind of get that, like Chris Ratcliffe saying the thick, meaty, spicy, kind of like the pit Q beef ribs. I guess he thinks it would be a great pair with that. Orange oil. Quite a lot of good tasty notes. Quite a lot of interesting tasty notes coming out of this.
There you go. Yeah, and I mean, typically with 10-year, the classic flavor profile is going to be a bolder rye spice, which will mean that pepper spice, but that baking spice, the cinnamon, that even baking chocolates, you know, that sort of leathery mid-palate back end, obviously finishing some great oak spice, great caramel. Now, 10-year single barrel doesn't necessarily have to mimic that. This barrel is one that stands wicked far apart from the regular 10-year, for me in particular, in terms of flavor profile, and it's something that absolutely deserves to be bottled on its own. So kudos to you guys for picking this one.
Well, like I said, I'd like to have taken the credit for picking this one. I was with Jamie. This is all Jamie that picked this.
Well, thank you, Jamie.
That's amazing. How do we feel about segueing nicely into the 18-year-old?
I think we feel pretty good. Yeah.
I don't think we're going to get too many holdups against that.
Sure thing. So 18-year. This is, I mean, 18-year is a whiskey that, what do I say about it? It's just so damn good. First of all, I'm excited to have it in this tasting because it's not something that is oftentimes included for various reasons. Price point, availability. I mean, this is even lower volume than Boss Hog by about a quarter the volume, about 25% less volume per year than Boss Hog. So it's not something that's easy to get per se. There's a good reason for that too. 18-year as a whiskey is a little bit different in terms of production process. Now, all of our whiskeys, as I mentioned, are blends for consistency to hit that specific flavor profile. 18-year is no different. But as we go up in age, you can imagine we're dealing with less and less quantity. And it's not just we have only this much 18-year-old whiskey. It's more of we have only this much 18-year-old whiskey that fits this flavor profile. Because I have a hell of a lot of 18-year-old plus whiskey that I don't want to put in anything I have. And in fact, I'm just sitting on waiting, you know. There's no use in putting whiskey in a bottle before it's ready. In fact, it just really gives you that negative sort of influence. And I mean, I'm one of those guys who, if I can taste it in the bottle and that's a negative for me, that's all it takes. I don't care if 99 other people can't taste it. If I can taste it, that means somebody else out there can also taste it. And probably more than just one person. For the 18-year, it was waiting. It was patience, really. I mean, this is a product that we wanted to release for quite a while. You can imagine when we put 15-year out, we had our sights set down the line. 15-year was being produced in 2015, came out in 2016. So back then we're sitting, waiting, just patiently seeing how this whiskey matures with an ideal flavor profile in mind. Now, the vital stats in the 18-year are going to give it a bit of a different base profile from the get-go. Usually with Whistlepig whiskey, we're looking at near 100% raw rye in the mash bill. It's not 100%, it's 94, 95. It's damn near above 91% almost across the board. Our one outlier on that front is going to be the 18-year. Now, the 18-year, we're usually seeing back-end innovation at Whistlepig with barrel finishing, with blending. The 18-year is an example of front-end innovation that, granted, we will see more of in the future. We have seen at Whistlepig with things like farm stock, but in terms of rye as a category, we haven't really seen many things like this. The mash bill for 18-year is 79% raw rye, which kind of a weird, seemingly arbitrary number in a sense, but really works quite well when you consider the extra adjuncts, which are 15% malted rye, flavor profile I'll get into in just a second, and to round it out, 6% malted barley. I like to say that mash bill doesn't matter quite as much as people think, insofar as I could give you a 95% rye mash bill, 5% malted barley, and 100% rye. And depending on how I mashed it, fermented it, distilled it, what I put it in, you could never tell the difference. You could never guess accurately which was which for various reasons. Now, when we talk about adding in other grains in a larger percentage than just 5-10%, we start to see a noticeable difference. With malted rye, you guys, I would assume, know the flavor of malted barley to some degree, so I won't go down that rabbit hole too much. I'm just generalizing here, you know, being in the UK, being part of a whiskey society might be the case. Malted rye, though, we don't really ever see anywhere. I mean, Old Potrero coming out of California might be one of the few examples in the US. There are some Polish brands as well, some Florida brands actually too, but it's not a flavor that we see that often because it's not a flavor that you want to see at a younger age. Rye malt is very similar to barley malt in the sense that it's very cereal forward. It's got that malty, sweeter, almost syrupy quality to it, but it's also got that inherent rye quality to it where it still has that spice character, just tamped down a little bit. It's got that biscuity character, which plays really nicely with that floral on the nose in particular, the lavender, the chamomile. Additionally, with those herbal tones, especially on the palate, that dill, that anise, that mint even, really meshes nicely. It's going to generally give us a bit of a softer aging profile. And the grain character might not be as noticeable because it's not something that we're used to in the first place. And it's also not something that is quite as bold as raw rye would be. Or raw rye, we taste it and we know that's rye. Malted rye is a little bit prettier. It's a little bit more nuanced. It's a little bit different. And it's something that we can absolutely see and taste in the 18-year. The 18-year is 92 proof for a good reason. After 18 years in cask, we lose a lot of distillate character, but again, we're sitting, watching, patiently waiting, flagging specific barrels that are hitting the right notes for us, that are evoking those distillate forward qualities, that are keeping that spice forward, baking spice centric raw rye character, and supplanting on top of that the malted rye, that beautiful floral character that's not going away, that sweetness, that biscuity character, really giving us this rounded whiskey that doesn't just go here and then kind of drop off, or doesn't just kind of bland. It's really going all across the board. The 18-year for me is a whiskey that, if you're looking for it, you can find almost every flavor you'd attribute to a whiskey possible. And what's really amazing about this whiskey too is that it spent 18 years in a brand new char number 3 barrel. 18 years in a used barrel, yeah, that's nothing to shake a stick at. You know, we're not worried about over extraction at that point. We're not really too concerned with the whiskey for anything other than maybe environmental reasons. But 18 years of new charred oak, I mean, we're managing out that over extraction in a very serious way. And even just adding in one barrel that's got too much of that wood on the back end can significantly skew something that's as small as the 18-year release because it's such a delicate flavor. What I get in the 18-year itself, and I'd love to hear your guys' tasting notes, hear what you guys are picking up, hear what you like about it. But what I get is a really nice rounded profile. It's a bit softer, a bit sweeter, a bit fruitier, but still retains those base rye characteristics that, to me, make a good rye no matter what. On the nose, we definitely get a lot of barrel extracts. Nothing over the top, but we get these really nice, for instance, baking spices in the nose that are coming from that actual barrel itself, not necessarily distillate, that you don't necessarily get quite as often. Additionally, some of that vanilla, but the stewed fruits as well. We're going to talk about stewed fruits quite a bit when we get to Boss Hog 5, but think about some sort of mulled pear, you know, a little bit of brandied cherries even, just sitting there, those aromatics wafting out. The journey on the palate for me continues too, where we get that nice mouthfeel. 92 proof is going to hold up on the palate quite well. We get that minerality, that viscosity there. It's present not just on the front palate, but on the mid side palates as well. It's giving me that rye spice character, not overwhelmingly so, but it's definitely very present. It's giving me something that I almost want to chew on if I could. And it's also giving me that floral character. The number one note that I get after I swallow the 18-year is this beautiful, lovely, sweeter floral character hanging out, coupled with that oak finish. 92 proof, 18 years, you'd expect to have a lot of oak content specifically on that finish, perhaps in the form of way too much tannin, astringent, maybe drying you out of the back end, almost like drinking sawdust. You'll find, I hope, that that is not the case at all with the 18-year. Again, certain barrels that have aged nicely, more gently. And one thing to note too is I have the benefit of having a lot of different sources of whiskey, which means I have a lot of different climates in which my whiskey ages. The climate in Calgary, Alberta is quite different from Shoreham, Vermont, which is quite different from Indiana. And that's going to give us ryes that are so unique and so different. And the 18-year, the biggest sort of step to get this whiskey to be something that we knew it had to be, which is nuanced, elegant, refined at 18, not just a wood bomb. It was a matter of finding what's the best whiskey that's been aging in a more gentle climate, hasn't been over extracting quite as much. So maybe not a super hot, super high, super dry rather climate that's going to really encourage quite a bit of barrel extraction, increase that ethanol content as well, will then serve to really pull a lot of aggressive sort of extracts from the barrel. How do we find this sort of gentler aging profile? Might have been in a more humid area for a bit of its life. Might have really not garnered too much proof over the years. And the answer was in 18-year. So for 18-year, we're blending at most a dozen barrels per batch, and it may not be the entirety of the barrel. And it's also worth keeping in mind that this whiskey is sat in cask for 18 years, so the volume of that cask is quite low. We're probably looking at most 65% to 70% of that whiskey having had evaporated out, so we're left about 30% in that barrel. Not much volume to work with here. It's a whiskey that I just don't have a bad thing to say about. I mean, this is a whiskey that I dare you, if you're this kind of person, and I know I'm gonna get a lot of flack for this, but put it in an old fashioned, because goddamn, this is what rye whiskey was made for. Pre-prohibition, rye whiskey was the cocktail spirit. And it's sacrilege to put something like 18-year in a cocktail. But if you're like me and during the R&D process, you know, you got a dump bucket and it's got 18-year in it, you might as well. And if that tastes damn good, you might as well tell the stewards. And they might as well tell their accounts. And lo and behold, I go out to Arizona and I see on the menu, granted it's $100, but it's an 18-year old fashioned. And I take a sip and it's the greatest thing I've ever had. So this is one of those whiskeys that I've taken sip after sip of this, and I've only ever thought, hell yes, and for different reasons. Again, that floral character, that herbal character, that gentle wood extract, the sweetness of it, but that underlying spice character as well. The pepper spice is there in a very nuanced, not muddled, but background way, and that baking spice is really taking center on the palate itself. It's coating with that viscosity. It's giving you that sort of, not straight up cinnamon per se, but that cardamom, that allspice, that nice nutmeg coating going on. It's going to leave you with a pleasant, very pleasant aftertaste in that finish. What are you guys picking up here yourselves?
I think it's interesting when you mention like the chamomile and the lavender. I think you get the really kind of delicate floral notes are definitely prominent in there. I think it's noticeably thinner than the last one. And you know, it's a much more delicate whiskey, and for 18 years old, I think that's quite unusual.
I'd say you're definitely right that it's quite a bit thinner. Now, it's taken that with a grain of salt because we're looking at a whiskey that's close to 120 proof that we just drank, so anything's probably going to taste a bit thin compared to that. You know, 92 proof, you're inherently going to have less viscosity than a higher proof whiskey would. But that being said, I mean, it's got the palate weight to it, and it's not just, if you've ever tasted a really over-oaked, say, bourbon, it is the thinnest thing in the world. It's such a separation between distillate and wood extract, and that's all you get. and it just doesn't give you anything on the palate. And oftentimes those whiskeys are 18, 19, 20 years old, aging in Kentucky in a very hot climate. Finding these whiskeys that don't give you that kind of disjointed finish, that separation of spirit and that thinness that it then gives you, and wood and that astringency it then gives you, it's a challenge for sure. And you know, you're not going to see 18-year volume increase anytime soon, because it's not something that we feel comfortable committing to any volume other than almost the bare minimum on a quality basis. So
the only thing I'd add to this, I think, would, because I think all the tasting notes that you've said are spot on, Pete, is just what you've achieved out of this whiskey on the palate. It's, you've got like, it's almost like this powdered sugar sweetness that kind of lingers on your lips, which is incredible for a whiskey that hasn't been finished in another barrel. It's almost as if it smells and tastes as though it's been finished in another barrel.
Right. Yeah, it's almost like a sweet fortified wine or something like that, or like a little bit of malt character. And I mean, that malt character does come through from that malted rye and that malted barley in that sort of sweetness on the nose, that sugary sweetness. But it's not any, you know, it's not just distillate character driven. It's those vanillins have really garnered super nicely in the cask that we've happened to choose for the 18 year. It's going to evoke those flavors for us. I mean, this is an after dinner whiskey. This is a dessert whiskey. This is a special occasion whiskey for sure. And we've definitely, this is one that we had a little fun with the packaging on too. I don't have a bottle in front of me right now, but it does look a little bit different from the typical Whistlepig. It's a bit wider. It's got a nice crystal decanter on top on it. And it's, instead of having a label on it, it's embossed too. So it does kind of encapsulate that idea of elegance. For me, it tastes that way as well. And that's really the aim here, is how do we, you know, if you think of this whiskey, where does it sit? This whiskey is punching up against 20, 25-year-old sherried scotches that are going to be a little bit sweeter, a little bit more delicate. Maybe not sherry bombs per se, but we're looking at some sherry, some next bourbon in the mix, maybe a little bit of Madeira or something like that to get that rounded profile. This whiskey is almost designed with those in mind. And I think it contends with almost all, if not all, you know, not specific to Scotch, but that age range and above, that flavor profile that we're looking for. And I think that this whiskey appeals to those drinkers. And I also want to say too, it's something a little bit different for Whistlepig, where it's more delicate, it's more nuanced. It's not in your face with flavor. It's not an explosion. It's not a punchy rye, but it's a very, very flavorful rye nonetheless for very different reasons.
Yep, sure. A couple of tasting notes from our members. We've got somebody said some of the comments have disappeared, unfortunately, but I remember Dan Bine. Dan said he noticed it tastes like the spiced German cookies. We've got Larry Sussman said he's just spent his kid's inheritance on bottles of these.
Good man, Larry. Good man.
Get a hat. Definitely get a hat.
Yeah. There's a lot of people saying that they find it. Dave Wild, the nose is a Easter bouquet of spring flowers with chessboard shaving on the back end. Now that's a nice tasting note.
There you go.
Well done,
wow,
there,
I feel like wow. How about that?
Cardamom with ginger. We got.
Oh yeah, the ginger note for sure. It's that spice character actually. Ginger is a great descriptor because it's not quite a peppery spice. It's more of that nuanced, sort of more delicate ginger. Again, not as aggressive spice character, and it does have a bit of that ginger flavor as well, not just the mouthfeel component. Nice one. Yeah.
Yeah, a couple of people are agreeing with what Andrew said, talking about the icing sugar. Somebody mentioned like a sponge cake.
Yeah, those just sweeter, biscuity, pastry-like. Those are flavors we typically associate with malt, you know.
Yeah, a couple of comparisons to Japanese whiskey as well from a few people.
Okay. Yeah, that delicate floral. Yeah, okay, I see. Hey, thank you for that, actually. That's a good point. We're hitting the same potential, not the same, but similar vein of floral notes, similar vein of malty notes, similar vein of a bit, I'd say lighter notes insofar as they're very present, but they're not jumping out of the glass at you. If you have a trained palate, you can find them and then some. Japanese whiskey, for me, definitely hits those notes. Yeah, wow, okay, 18 year, yeah. Not just for Scotch drinkers, for the Japanese.
Personally, that was pretty incredible to hear all that, Pete. I mean, pretty much nailed every single aspect of everything I was saying. I got Lotus biscuits, a lot of it, like really kind of soup. Well, the most decadent Lotus biscuits I'm ever going to have. But I don't know about you, but I've got a Boss Hog here that's burning a
Oh yeah,
hole in
I was
my,
about to say.
tasting mat.
Let's switch gears here.
Absolutely.
And,
Full disclosure to those who are watching, I told these guys, hey, guess what? I like to talk. Christian, you know I like to talk. Keep me honest, shut me the hell up. They've done a terrible job thus far, so it's their fault. Let's switch gears here, though. Let's move away from the nuanced, away from the delicate, away from the sort of lighter to medium flavor profile to something a little bit different, to some would say the opposite of that. And let's move to the Boss Hog series. Let me give you just a little bit of background on Boss Hog before we dive right in here too. Now, Boss Hog as a whiskey for us means something very specific. And it's so specific that every year it's going to be completely different. So keep that in mind. What that means to us is we're looking at whiskey that is not just our oldest, not just our highest proof, not just our weirdest, but quite simply put, whiskey that is our best at cask strength, our best with a unique finish, whiskey that's totally unique from anything we've done before, whiskey that is just simply stupendous no matter what, and whiskey that is truly powerfully complex, that really gives you this idea of rye being this bold, flavorful, spicy, yes, but also so much more, and what that truly means. And for us, that means something very different every year. Luckily for us, thank you, BBS, we get to taste two very, very unique, very different versions of this in Boss Hog 5 and 6. We're going to start with Boss Hog 5, but I'd also definitely recommend saving a little bit of 5 at least to taste again 6 and getting that full picture here. So Boss Hog started back in, just a little background, back in 2012 was the first release with Boss Hog 1. Quite simply put, it was a cask strength, close to 140 proof, close to 13-year-old rye whiskey, which at the time was liquid gold. Beautiful. I go back and taste it now, I'm like, ugh, who put this in the bottle? It's fantastic, but it just goes to show how much the idea of what rye can be, what premium rye can be, and what a cask strength rye can be has changed over the past 10 years. At the time, Boss Hog 1 was the only thing, barring a few others, for instance, Buffalo Trace Antique, the only cask strength, well-aged rye that you could possibly get. And the flavor was unlike anything anybody had before. And that really set the stage for Boss Hog moving forward. Boss Hog 2 followed in the same vein. It was a bit older, 13 years, a bit lower in proof, which was a good call on my book because it was a bit more palatable. It is meant to be drank at cask strength rather than being cask strength, not for the sake of, but to satisfy people like Andrew who love that higher proof, you know, who just are looking for that punchier whiskey, who know what they're working with too, who know to add some water in there, let it sit, let it open up. But Boss Hog 2 step in a bit of a different direction where we're really defining this whiskey as not just cask strength, but cask strength in terms of exquisitely sippable and just beautifully, beautifully palatable no matter what you do to it. Ice, no ice. I mean, put it in a cocktail. Like I said, about 18 years, people do these things and it tastes goddamn delicious. But come Boss Hog 3, we started working on this idea of cask finishing. And it did come about around the same time as 12-year-old did. So you see this behind the scenes innovation happening with different cask finishes. The first cask finish on Boss Hog 3 was a dechar, rechar, Isla hogshead. Without going too far into it, if you don't know, basically had our cooperage partners take a couple old Isla hogshead barrels that had aged in peated scotch. They took the heads off, they scraped off the inside char, they recharred it, and they sent it over to us. Quick finish, gave us some nice smoky character, not overwhelming, really supplanted that rye quite nicely, tamped down the heat a little bit with the new char layer, and gave us a beautiful cask strength whiskey. Boss Hog 4 won Best Whiskey at San Francisco, had an Armagnac finish, totally different from the year before. And the cask size itself is about twice the size of the hogshead. The flavor profile of Boss Hog 4 could not be any different from Boss Hog 5. And it is at this point that we truly have an idea of, okay, this is something that deserves to exist quite a bit. And this is something that we will do every year if we can. If we can't, then we won't. But we're always going to stick to these tenets. We're always going to try to give you something uniquely different than what we've done before. And we saw that coming out right after something like Boss Hog 4, which miles different from Boss Hog 3, that Isla barrel versus that Armagnac barrel for Boss Hog 4. Boss Hog 5, at face value, you might think, that's a little bit similar in terms of specifics. We're looking at for Boss Hog 5, Calvados cask, which, much like Armagnac, is a brandy, is a French brandy, actually. So we're looking like we're starting in the same place here. But I just love tasting people on it because it couldn't be more different. Now, Armagnac is a great brandy coming out of the sort of Armagnac region, believe it or not, of France. It's very vinous in nature, it's sweet, it's fruity, but it's totally different from something like Calvados. Calvados is an apple brandy. It does have quite a bit of these apple notes, but the Calvados cask itself too has so much depth to it. These casks are typically used for a very long time, 20, 30, 40 years perhaps. It's really pulled a lot of that wood that I don't necessarily want to extract for my 14-year-old plus whiskey that I'm putting into this finishing cask. It's pulled a lot of this wood. It's added in a lot of sort of really nuanced, oxidated, really, I mean, by this point, it's almost like a Solera in a sense, where we've had Calvados from so many different vintages, from so many different varietals that we're getting such a rounded flavor profile from this barrel. And so from the cask itself, we get flavors that might not be inherent in Calvados itself. What I get in this whiskey, and before I get into that, actually, I'll talk about the base whiskey. The base whiskey for Boss Hog 5 was a 13-year-old, almost 14 years. If we had waited 2 months, it would have been 14, but age is just a number. 14, almost years old, MGPI, between 115 and 120 proof. That is finished for about a month and a week in this Calvados cask. So not a very long finishing time at all. And you'll see that across the board at Whistlepig. We don't typically finish things for too long. We're not looking to completely transform it. We're looking to add in a bit of a top note. And additionally, after aging a new charred oak, you don't necessarily want to sit in a finishing cask for too long because you will pull the actual wood compounds and it will overwhelm that whiskey quite a bit. For Boss Hog 5, these brandy notes are so nuanced for me. So the whiskey itself was a bit more baking spice forward. Usually we look at Alberta whiskeys as a bit more spice forward, just that general pepper spice, that perhaps ginger spice, whereas MGPI might have a bit more of that softer baking spice side of things, the cinnamon, the nutmeg, the clove, those more sort of mid to back palate flavors. Boss Hog 5 started with a lot of these beautiful flavors. I mean, it drank beautifully just as is at cask strength with no finish on it, which said to us, this deserves a cask finish because it was really looking for something extra. It's slightly fruity as a base whiskey. What we're tasting in this glass is definitely more than just slightly fruity. I'd say, in fact, it's quite fruity, and there's a good reason for that. That Calvados cask, having so many different varietals of Calvados in it for so many years, developed such a rich, vibrant apple flavor. Not just apple, but apple, pear, dark winter fruits even. And that translates to the cask finish in a way that mixes so well with the base whiskey, which already had a bit of this fruity character, and additionally was a bit softer in the first place, so it could take on flavor very well. So what I'm getting out of this cask finish specifically is, on the nose, again, those stewed fruits. It's almost like I'm halfway through making a mulled cider. All I'm doing is macerating these fruits. I've got pear, I've got some cinnamon in there, and it's really just baking in the kitchen. That's what I'm getting there. I can't wait to dip my finger in it. I'm also getting some of this nice wood character. That Calvados cask is a French oak cask, and it is pretty spent, but we did pull some of that spice character. French oak will typically give us a bit more of that spice than an American oak will. So we can imagine that using a finishing barrel that is made out of French oak will give us a little bit more spice. We get that on the nose. We also get that on the finish and mid palate a little bit. This Boss Hog 2, my barrel is 96. It's 115.8 proof, so it's going to be a little bit lower on the proof end for Boss Hogs, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be any less punchy. And in fact, I recall, I mean, a whole year and a half ago, but I'm deep in Boss Hog 7 right now, so you can imagine how things get confused in my mind. But I recall that this 115.8 was one of the punchier barrels too. That's one of the natures of cask strength whiskey, is just to Andrew's point, just because it's the lowest proof sample doesn't mean it's not going to drink like it's the highest proof in a great way too. Now, the Calvados finish too isn't just apples, straight up apples, and isn't just French oak mulled together. It really also gives us this slight floral side, much like the 18-year, and slight herbal side as well, where it's not necessarily dill, but it's more of an anise. It's more of an aggressive, really finishing characteristic. It sticks on your tongue, it coats the palate, and it has quite a bit of mouthfeel to it. And at this point, I'm a little bit sick of hearing myself talk, so I'd love to hear what you guys think of Boss Hog 5, and definitely the consumers out there for sure. This is a whiskey too. Keep this in mind, most barrels are 200 liters in size. These barrels were only about 170 liters. So not quite a quarter cask, but very small. So it was a much more aggressive finishing. So keeping to that shorter finishing length was very important for us. I mean, a matter of 3 days could have over extracted significantly and ruined one of these barrels easily. And in fact did, and we actually drank that one ourselves on the farm. So silver linings.
I mean, this to me is, this sings to everything that I love in a whiskey. It's like real kind of apple forward, that orchid fruits, without question, that cinnamon. It's almost like an apple pie atom bomb just going off in your mouth.
Yep.
It's a real kind of exciting whiskey. I mean, one question I do have about the Boss Hog range is when you start to think about them, when you start to like decide that this cask is going to be Boss Hog, is it an intentional process or is it kind of a multiple experiments that you're doing at one time and then you kind of sync on one? It's like, this stuff is just ridiculously great. This is going to be the Boss Hog. Because obviously we have so many finishes that we have experimented with and released in the past. Like, which one kind of, what's the criteria for it to become a Boss Hog?
That's a great question, right? And I'd like to say the answer is yes on both angles. Insofar as we definitely have an idea of what we're doing, but we also just stumble upon it quite a bit. One program that we have that we don't talk about all that much is the 12-year single finish program. Just a quick background. All the time at Whistlepig, we are finishing anywhere from a dozen to 20 unique casks that we've never done before. Could be a fortified wine like Tokai, could be a non-fortified wine like a simple Merlot, could be something crazy like a different wood type, Caucasian oak or, you know, acacia oak, could be anything in between. Something like that is also a great trial program, as an aside, for Boss Hog, because from this program we see, oh damn, that Tokai finish is amazing, or that Bordeaux finish didn't work quite as well as I'd expected. And through this process, and we're not just finishing with just the 12-year, we're also doing things like 15-year, which are using granted Vermont oak, but that's just data points for us, where we have an idea of, okay, here's how our whiskey finishes, and here's how it finishes in X barrel, Y barrel, Z barrel. Here's how whiskey from this distillery and that distillery and this distillery finishes. Okay, Boss Hog 5, we're looking at a fruitier, spicier, really sort of, not necessarily sweet forward, but it's not a spice bomb of a rye. So how do we sort of turn that on its head on the next release? Not just for the sake of, but trying to give people variety, much like BBS is picking unique 10-year barrels from the one they just picked before. We are trying to give you unique Boss Hogs year in, year out. So for the Boss Hog process, it's a little bit of that happy accident where the single finish program, we had 3 barrels of the past 4 years that have finished amazingly. And I'm certainly planning on using this one in Boss Hog, just not sure quite yet when, because maybe we don't have the base whiskey in the volume we need that would finish appreciably. Or maybe I just can't get the kind of cask at the moment because the way the world's working. Additionally, we are forecasting out as much as we can, where when we are releasing, say, Boss Hog 6, I'm already working on Boss Hog 7 trials and have been for quite a while. And, you know, we've got something in the pipe, and it might not be definite. In fact, it might take 3-7 months to get a definite, here's what Boss Hog is going to be, but we've got our angles. We're always working on something. And just because something isn't Boss Hog 7, it might be Boss Hog 9, it might be Boss Hog 10. You know, just because we've done one thing 1 year instead of another thing, doesn't mean we can't keep that arrow in the quiver and shoot at it a little bit later. You know, you'll see that too in years to form in the past come out as a Boss Hog. And I think people are going to be really happy to see that, maybe taste some flavors they're used to, and also challenge their palate quite a bit with some flavors they're absolutely not used to. So Boss Hog 5, for me, was that sort of result of a happy accident and that planning, where not only did we discover Calvados through the 12-year single finish, insofar as we did a single barrel finish on some 12-year-old plus whiskey to sell to an account as a single barrel, but we also had a line on various Calvados finishes. So instead of just trialing one type of Calvados or getting in 3 barrels of the same type of Calvados and trialing whiskey in those 3, we were able to actually get upwards of 6 different types of Calvados barrels from different, not different producers per se, but different styles, if you will. That gave us a huge jumping off point. Okay, we have a lot of flexibility, room to grow. Do we like this sort of fruitier forward? Do we like this more stewed fruit? Do we like this more kind of drier style? Get on to Boss Hog 6, the idea of how does Boss come about will become a little bit clearer, because that's probably the most involved by leaps and bounds boss hog we've had to date. But boss hog really is just, at the end of the day, those 5 things. We are looking for this whiskey that's going to be distinctly unique. We're looking for this whiskey that is going to be cask strength. And for us, that doesn't just mean high proof. Again, that means worthy of being consumed at cask strength. Whiskey that's going to finish beautifully in a totally unique finishing cask, and it just has to be stupendous no matter what. That's what boss hog is to us. We work within these parameters, and boss hog tastes different year in, year out for that exact reason. I can't wait till you come back to the farm, Christian, to taste you on boss hog 7 in progress, actually, and get your take on it. So
yeah,
what are you guys getting out of boss hog 5 that really is singing to your heart here, by the way? And if it's nothing, tell me. I won't take it personally.
First thing I noticed when I had the nose on it was I thought there was kind of a candied orange or a bit of orange oil in the back there.
I get I get like a tart tatin. You know, when you like you tuck into a tart tatin, you get that real stewed kind of apple.
Yeah, okay.
That's what I get with the raisins and the currants and the rest of it. Cinnamon, yeah, it's that I get a lot of that.
A couple of tasty notes from some of the guys in the group. Scott James Turner Priest says he gets dark chocolate, leather, and a little bit of salt. He says it reminds him of the kind of chocolate liqueurs that you get at Christmas, with the fruity, the brandy filled ones. Yeah,
okay.
I think that's an interesting one. Glenn Hopkins says it reminds him of Del Monte canned pears, which is interesting.
Well, that's Calvados.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Assume that's a positive.
Yeah. Sean French, he said it's got a lot going on. I'm getting a syrup finish, smoke up front, and it's very, very well rounded. I've been disappointed by expensive whiskies in the past, but I see where this is coming from. Matt Joachim says the nose has a burn to it, but the whiskey is really rich. Christmas pudding and plums. And Dan Beinbaum says pipe tobacco and hobbit feet.
I prefer to be called halflings. Yeah, I get it's such a nice like candied ginger kind of almost like sweet shop. You know, for me, it's like these little button candies that are just straight up sugar, but have a little bit more to it. You know, it's that sweeter side of rye, but not necessarily full tilt, right? You know, it's got a little bit for everybody. Ooh, okay. With that in mind, I'd like to turn this into a bit of a dual tasting where let's continue to think about Boss Hog 5. Let's not stop tasting it. I hope you haven't just taken it right down the hatch. If you have, it's Friday. It's close to 9 o'clock, so I don't blame you. But let's switch gears and move to Boss Hog 6 a little bit. I'd love you guys to taste it as I talk about it. One thing that I hate so much, again, as a person who just loves to talk, is when people wait for me to stop talking to drink things. Come on, dude, please. Start tasting, get an idea of it, formulate your opinion, you know, and then eventually get me to shut up too by jumping in, you know. Boss Hog 6, man, this is something I'm still riding the high off of, even though it's been almost about 8 months, 7 months since it was truly released. Boss Hog 6 could not be more different from Boss Hog 5. And in fact, there's so much to Boss Hog 6, I feel like we need to have a whole nother tasting just to talk about it in depth. Boss Hog 6 really embraced this idea of how do we make this Boss Hog unique from anything we've done before, and not just in the barrel finish itself. How do we really push the boundaries here? And for us, the answer was collaboration, a true collaboration where instead of working with a barrel broker or even a producer to get a line on some of their casks, how do we really partner with somebody? And we happen to have had our sights set on Japan for quite a while due to various connections we had through people like Dave Pickrell, various industry connections over the years when he was working with Beam, various other companies. Long story short, this led us to have a trip over to Japan. Last year, I went with various members of the marketing production team, popped over to Japan. We met with a couple different people at distilleries like Chichibu, at a wonderful brewery called Kataya, which we ended up partnering with because we had, again, this idea, we want to go to Japan. Maybe it's shochu, maybe it's umishu, maybe it's, hell, Mizunara, something like that. But let's see what there is to offer instead of just taking a flyer and, you know, getting some hybrid Mizunara barrels and calling it a day, you know, just for the pedigree of it. That's not something that I really want to do. I want to make a whiskey that's targeted, that's going to evoke the right flavors and be unique. That isn't just, you know, a name on a label. The answer for us was, man, it's super complicated. But the answer for us was, let's partner with Kataya Brewery. if you're unfamiliar, Kitaya is a brewery in the Fukuoka province of, or prefecture rather, of Japan. They are producing world-class sake, world-class shochu, which is a distilled sake. It can also be a distilled just sort of beer made from various starch sources, but it's sort of the next step in sake, much like whiskey is a distilled beer. They're also making something called umishu, which we don't really know too much about, at least in the US. In the UK, maybe it's a little bit more common, but, you know, worldwide, umishu is not that well known. Umishu, for most people, I was going to say the uninitiated, but umishu is the last step in this wonderful world of sake, where sake is a delicious rice wine, but it can become so many other things. If we distill sake, we get shochu, which is a lighter spirit. I say lighter, that's when it goes in the bottle, but we distill sake, we get a heavier, sort of funky rice spirit that then goes into barrels, typically use bourbon barrels for a couple years, pulls some character, pulls some color, but has been charcoal filtered quite a bit to remove a lot of that character, a lot of that color, a lot of that flavor, to give you a very light, non-whiskey-like spirit. Now, that's not enough for Kitaya. They take the shochu and they decide to then place it in a aging container, not a barrel, but just a stainless steel tank. And they take ume plums as well, these very small, bitter yet sweet, tart yet floral, dense yet soft, green plums. They throw them in there with the shochu, they throw in a bunch of sugar, and they let that sit and macerate. Now, typically in the umishu production process, an umishu brewer will let that sit for maybe 3 months, maybe 6 months, pulls some of that flavor from the plum or whatever fruit's in there, pulls some of that sugar flavor, not necessarily anything too complex. That wasn't enough for us. In true Whistlepig fashion, we decided to go with Kitaya's 11.5-year aged umishu, which really has these insane, I mean, again, these tart notes, these fruity notes, but really developed quite a bit. It's almost like a well-rested wine would taste, where it's got that bouquet on the front. It's not just the juicy you might expect. It's got this mouthfeel to it, surprisingly. It's not just sugary and thin and tart and even dry on the back end. Now, umishu is not a barrel-aged spirit, though. You might have heard no mention of a barrel there whatsoever. It's a bit of a problem if you want to finish whiskey in a barrel. So we decided, again, true collaboration nature, all right, Kitaya, let's work together. Let's make a barrel-aged umishu, which will then make barrels for us to finish whiskey in. And not only any barrel-aged umishu, but let's age that in some of our Vermont oak. So we had a lot of umishu sent over to our facility in the US. We then filled Vermont oak barrels with, so these are brand spanking new toasted charred Vermont oak barrels. We then seasoned for about 2.5 months in the summertime, seasoned and also barrel aged, because we're not just dumping out this umishu much like a sherry producer would who's producing sherry barrels for whiskey. We're looking to produce umishu that's quite palatable. In fact, umishu that's better than what went into the cask. So a shorter seasoning time gave us a lighter extract in that barrel itself, which then produced some wonderful barrel-aged umishu, which you definitely cannot get in the US, the UK, anywhere but Japan, I believe. We then took some incredibly bold 16-year-old plus 120 plus proof ABL 100% rye whiskey. Now, if you like the 15-year, think about the 15-year on steroids. Think about the 15-year amped up quite a bit, a little bit extra age, a little bit extra oak compounds extracted from that. That was our base whiskey that we were working with for Boss Hog 6. Really bold, really character forward. Not something that I would typically finish in a sweeter, more delicate barrel. But there was a lot of room to play here. When we taste Boss Hog 6, we can taste this interplay between that huge, bold, spicy, really aggressive and punchy rye. After 16 years, that grain character is huge. Those oak extracts are really coming through, especially on the finish. And a lot of that sort of sweetness, maple syrup, caramel on the nose as well. How do we partner that then and evoke the flavors of that umishu? And the answer is the umishu just filled in the blanks. And that's what you want to see in a finishing cast. Is you've got a vision, you've got an idea in mind. Maybe you've tried a barrel like it in the past with similar whiskey, but until you actually taste that whiskey, you don't quite know. And when I finish barrels in a trial, I will let the barrel finish past where I think it's done to prove myself right, if you will. If I think it's done at 3 weeks, I'll let it go for 3 weeks and 2 days, 3 weeks and a half. And if at 3 weeks and a half, it's definitely worse, then we know for sure we've hit our mark. So with this 16-year-old whiskey, we put it in this barrel for really, we didn't quite know off the bat what it was going to be. We assumed at most 2 months because we didn't want to overwhelm it with the new char, the new toast and whatnot. But we also wanted to pull plenty of that Amishu flavor. The result is a nicely rounded whiskey that has beautifully nuanced, slight but incredibly present notes of Amishu. Those come through on the nose. You get these. You also get this really nice umami note, not just on the nose, but on the palate in particular. That's coming from that maceration that's happening for 11 and a half years. It's really building some of these meatier notes, which in a bolder rye whiskey play for me quite beautifully. And I was really happy that we were able to achieve this profile, that sort of more savory side of Amishu, rather than just a sweeter, more sort of floral, what you might expect from a plum liqueur. That savory side really makes this whiskey stand up on its own. And it reminds me of almost a Mortlock or something that's known to be a bit beefier. And it translates to that mouthfeel as well. There's so many angles here, not just the Amishu coming in with on the nose, on the palate, that actual plum character and that sort of savory character, but the Vermont oak too is coming in with a little bit of char to clean up that whiskey, where we're getting a really clean finish, but it adds a little bit of smoke on that finish as well. On the nose, we get a little bit extra vanilla, a little bit extra caramel, a little bit extra maple syrup and cyclotine and all those sort of sweeter, tangible aromatics that really just sort of tease us. On the palate too, we really get a lot of spice. It's not necessarily thin on the mouth at all, but it's not necessarily the thickest thing ever because it's so, not aggressively spicy, but so presently spicy. It's one of those that you feel not just mid-palate the spice, but you feel the side palate spice, you feel the front palate spice. You definitely feel the finishing spice on that as well. The weight of this, for me, is just perfect. If this had sat in cask for a little bit longer, it would have definitely given me that sort of real negative astringent dry finish. But I want you guys to guess how long this was finished for in this brand new toasted charred Amishu seasoned cask after being aged in a brand new barrel for 16 years. Keep in mind, we do like to finish short around here, but this could be a trick question.
I reckon really short. I reckon this is, I'd say, a matter of weeks as opposed to months.
I have no idea.
Good man. So
I'm going to go with
well,
the
you're
short.
about to get it.
Really short.
You get a prize if you guess it right.
I'm going to go with 6 weeks.
I think people might have cut out. I'm going to spoil the surprise. Hey, okay, so 5 weeks. This sat in cask for 5 weeks.
That's close enough.
A couple extra days. Some of these barrels would have pulled way too much on the back. Yeah, close enough,
Yeah.
right? Team close enough. Gotta love it. But, 6 weeks would have been too much. And some of this sat for just 1 month, 4 weeks. Some of it sat for an extra week. In between, maybe some was dumped at the month and 3 days point. But it's that nature of every barrel is going to finish a little bit differently. And this year we didn't have any barrels that overfinished. Like I said, with Bossog 5, we did have one that we just kept on the farm and drank ourselves. But we love barrel finishing, and not just for the sake of. We love barrel finishing in the most nuanced, perfected, defined way, where we're not, God by any means, but I like to think we have a better idea of how our rye is going to finish than maybe most people would, because we've been able to try so many. We're really just fortunate at the end of the day that we have 100 different types of wine that we've put rye whiskey into, and therefore we can hopefully give you something in the form of Bossog that you're going to want to taste time and time again. For me, Bossog 5 and 6 could not be more different too. They're both very much rye. One's 100% rye in Bossog 6, one's 95% rye in Bossog 5. They're both well-aged. We're looking at close to 14 on Bossog 5, 16 years old on Bossog 6. But that's really where the similarities stop. And it's really hard when I ask people, what's your favorite Bossog? Because it almost feels like you're picking a favorite child, at least for me, and then I wait for people after the fact say, hey, it's Bossog 3 for sure, But it's really difficult because it's such a polarized skew in that sense. If people can't give me a consensus in a room of 20 people what the best Bossog is, that means we're doing our job, because Bossog should not be similar year in, year out. Bossog should be something distinctly unique from what we've done before. And I think we're definitely hitting this, at least with 5, at least with 6. I would like to think with 7, although TBD. Come to the farm and I'll let you have a little taste. You can give me your thoughts on it, and we'll go from there. But
yeah, just to let you know,
the beautiful things.
People are kind of putting them in the favourites and saying what the favourites are, and there is there is a wide range of what people, you know, nobody's unanimous with anything. So there you go.
There is no wrong answer, you know.
What's been the feedback, Chris, on the tasting notes for Samurai Scientist?
So we got some good ones come in. Let me just get those up. So some interesting ones. I mean, I thought immediately, I thought I got a custardy flavor off the nose, you know, like vanilla-y custard. But then other people are putting in, Alex Gillum came in with some interesting notes. He said rhubarb, gooseberry, apple and ginger crumble with vanilla custard. So we got the custard as well. A touch of smoky barbecue and fresh baked cinnamon and raisin cookies. Neil Cole's saying he's getting toasted flavors, a little bit of sweet candy that gives away to cigar and spice, and then the toast comes back in the finish. Jason Carlyon said, this is one of the most complex on the nose for me. I'm getting all sorts of different aromas. Grape, aniseed, pine, light wood smoke, caramel biscuit. He said the spiciness really comes to the fore on the palate and there's a real sweetness. And then Sean French said the finish just keeps on going and going. There's lots of white pepper on there as well.
That's some awesome tasting notes. I feel like we've definitely kind of really got to know the drams that we've been poured tonight insanely well, and I think it's getting past watershed now. So don't know about you guys, but maybe we should look to...
Full disclosure, that's my fault. I apologize.
No. I think it's been so enlightening to hear the actual kind of flavor forwards from the actual focus of what you're looking at as a master blender and what goes into glass to such a revered whiskey, to be quite honest. I want to say a massive thank you on my behalf to you guys, the BBS, for putting this together, to making such an amazing experience for Pete and myself to be able to be here to talk about Whistlepig. Amazing work from Axiom as well for getting all of these samples out. It's 90 samples, I believe, out to all you guys to be able to try this along with us tonight. So please give Axiom a like on Instagram if you can. Remember, support the independents. It's Axiom_brands on Insta. And again, that's my humble thanks for. And Pete as well, thank you very much for making the time to go through it all with us as well.
Yeah, guys, thanks so much for setting this up, for having me. BBS, what a pleasure. Christian, as always. You know, we'll have a follow-up video where it's a little bit more intimate after just you and me, but such a pleasure, man. I mean, thanks for setting this up. This is how we beat coronavirus, guys. Is things like this, you know, is I get out of my tree stand and I just get in front of the computer and we taste some whiskey on a Friday, you know. I couldn't do without you guys, so thanks for coming.
I'll drink to that.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks very much. I mean, we really appreciate what you've done, what the guys at Axiom have done to get all these out, and Christian and Peter, both of you guys, for your time. So we'll end the stream now, and thank you very much once again, guys. Cheers.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much, guys, and thanks for tuning in. Appreciate it.
Cheers. You too. Thank you.